This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Yves Engler. And today we're going to be talking about the foreign interference panic in this country and Bill C70, recently passed legislation countering foreign interference. To me, the foreign interference panic is principally a US intervention in Canadian politics. It's a way to prod this country, despite opposition from important segments of corporate Canada, to joining the US bid to contain China's rise. And if you look at the institutions in this country kind of pushing the foreign interference issue, pushing the conflict with China issue, they are the institutions that are the most connected, deeply integrated with the US, being the Canadian military, CSIS, Communication Security Establishment. But even if you look at it at a personal level, down at the individual level, you'll find that a number of the individual commentators pushing the foreign interference frenzy, they are in fact funded by the US government for their lobbying in Canada. So for instance, Metne Toti, who's the head of the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, who's been quoted dozens of times about Chinese interference in Canada, his organization was actually set up in 2020 with funding from the US government explicitly to lobby Canada's parliament. So at a macro level, that's my thesis about the foreign interference brouhaha we've been seeing over the past handful of years. Within that, today we have lawyer and activist Dimitri Lascaris to break down some elements of the foreign interference discussion. He's written a couple pieces recently detailing legislation, the Bill C70, but also a piece that looks at the claims that were made around Chinese interference and the role that CSIS has played in kind of pushing those claims and whether they're to be trusted. So first of all, thanks for coming on Talking Foreign Policy, Dimitri.
Pleasure to be here, Yves. Thank you for having me.
And can you just sort of like break down this question? First of all, I guess maybe if you have any comment on the kind of macro picture, but then into the about what is foreign interference in Canada, but then also in terms of the piece you wrote around whether CSIS is a sort of credible, that they should just be taken at their face or trusted with their allegations without sort of receiving the evidence of what's of their claims.
So I think you and I are partly in agreement, and we also partly diverge on the macro picture. I agree that it's entirely fair to characterize this as a US intervention. When it comes to Canadian foreign policy, so much about our foreign policy is ultimately dictated from Washington in a variety of ways, whether we like it or not. And that's the reality of the situation. But I don't think the principal opposition in Canada to this foreign interference hysteria, you called it panic, I think that's fair, I call it hysteria, is being driven principally by sectors of the mining industry. I think there are elements, there are particular constituencies within the Canadian mining industry. And by the way, we have the biggest mining stock exchange in the world, the TSX, Toronto Stock Exchange. The mining industry is extremely powerful in this country, but most of the mining industry is aligned with the neocons in Washington. Their agendas overlap and they're not in conflict. There are some companies, but none of them I think is particularly influential in the conversation, who are opposed to straining relations with countries like China and India and Russia. But for the most part, the mining industry in Canada is not invested in the jurisdictions which have been deemed by the neocons to be the official enemies of the West. For the most part, they are invested in jurisdictions which Western governments, including the neocons in Washington, are exploiting ruthlessly. For example, Africa and South America and so forth. So I think the principal opposition in Canada to the belligerents, and they're trying to build public support for belligerents towards Russia and towards China and towards Iran and so forth, is coming from the anti-imperialist movement and the left, which in this country, despite all of their weaknesses and limitations are considerably more influential than they are in the United States. And we are particularly concerned in this country about, there's so much talk about increasing military spending because we in this country want our government to focus on things like healthcare. We're accustomed to having a robust system of national healthcare. And a lot of Canadians are cognizant that if we start shifting huge amounts of money to military spending, which is exactly what the neocons in Washington want us to do, and the military industrial complex in the United States wants us to do, then there's going to be less money for healthcare spending, for our social insurance program, for our educational system, and so forth. So I think that the foreign interference hysteria is primarily targeting the left and the anti-imperialist move in this country. It's not primarily designed to stifle dissent within the mining industry, which I think is largely aligned with Washington. So that being said, and I find your interpretation plausible. At the end of the day, it's hard to know because you and I don't have a hotline to Washington or to Ottawa exactly what's going on. I think your interpretation is certainly plausible, but on the evidence, I tend towards the one that I've just articulated. Now, in terms of, let me start with Bill C70, and then maybe I'll pause there and we can talk about the foreign interference report that the National Security Intelligence Committee put out earlier in June. Bill C70 does a lot of things. This is a countering foreign interference piece of legislation, which was rammed through Parliament with the cooperation of all the other political parties in Parliament, effectively. They all signed on to this being rammed through with no meaningful debate. And it amends a lot of legislation. I didn't have time because this happened so quickly and this bill is so huge and complex to go through all of its provisions and then see how it was amending existing legislation like the criminal code, like the CSIS Act and other pieces of legislation to determine whether there was a concern, a civil liberties concern or other concern. I focused on one particular piece of legislation that is being amended by Bill C70. And that legislation is called the Security of Information Act. I didn't even know this act existed until I read Bill C70, which should tell you something. I've been practicing law for over 30 years. If I didn't know this bill existed or this legislation existed, probably the vast majority of Canadians have no idea. And the Security of Information Act, as it was written before Bill C70 came into effect, imposes the most severe penalty that Canada's Constitution permits, which is life imprisonment. We don't permit capital punishment in this country, on those who use threats, accusations, or violence to benefit foreign entities. So Section 20 of this, the pre-existing legislation is the one that I focused on the most. And what that said before Bill C70 was enacted was every person commits an offense who at the direction of, for the benefit of, or in association with a foreign entity or a terrorist group, induces or attempts to induce by threat, accusation, menace, or violence any person to do anything or cause anything to be done that, and this is the key part, or two of the key parts, A, is for the purpose of increasing the capacity of a foreign entity or a terrorist group to harm Canadian interests, or B, that is reasonably likely to harm Canadian interests. So the penalty for this is life imprisonment if you violate this provision, Section 20 of the Security of Information Act. But in order for the Crown to prove your guilt, it had to show that basically you were intending to cause harm to Canadian interests, or your behavior was reasonably likely to harm Canadian interests. So Bill C70 eliminates those requirements completely. So the Crown no longer has to prove any harm to Canadian interests. It doesn't have to prove that there was even a risk of harm to Canadian interests. It doesn't have to prove that you sought to harm Canadian interests. Furthermore, it adds the word intimidation to the preamble. So, the way it's drafted now is you have to engage in a threat, accusation, menace, or violence. They've added the word intimidation. And this is very concerning because we are seeing a lot of claims within the public discourse in Canada that perfectly legitimate forms of protest and dissent constitute intimidation. To give an example, which a lot of our listeners will be familiar with, there are many pro-Israel students on the university campuses of Canada right now who claim to be intimidated by these encampments that have sprung up, even though the protesters in these encampments have not engaged in any violence or threats of violence. They say they're intimidated just because they use the word intifada, which in Arabic means shaking off. They're intimidated because they hear the word revolution. They're intimidated because the encampment protesters are condemning Zionism, which is an ideology, not a religion, not an ethnicity. It's an ideology. They're intimidated because people are wearing the keffiyeh, which has great cultural and historical significance for Palestinians, is not in any way, shape, or form a threat or a menace. So, and I could go on and on. In my article on my website, I give other examples of how so-called intimidating conduct is in fact legitimate and time-honored forms of protest and dissent. So this legislation, in my view, and as I said, I haven't done a comprehensive review because it's just too dense. There's too much in it for me to do that by myself within the limited time that was afforded to us. But this legislation is effectively, in my view, criminalizing in the most severe way potentially legitimate forms of protest and criticism against Canada's morally bankrupt foreign policy. We should be deeply concerned about this. And personally, as a lawyer, because I wasn't able to stop it from being passed into law, I would be happy as a lawyer to challenge this under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I'm frankly looking for opportunities to do that because I think this law is an absolute travesty.
And we should say that it was like 6 weeks from when it was presented to adopt it, which is, my understanding is like absolutely, even the post 9/11 terrorism legislation that was rammed through quickly, my understanding is this was passed even quicker than that. And there was very little, like I'm like you, and actually until your article, I seen a little bit here and there. Rabble published John Price's piece where there was like 14 civil society organizations that called for slowing down the process and to have a more full debate. But it was very limited kind of debate in the public arena on this legislation, which has fairly significant ramifications. I was just, one of the things I found kind of like maybe ironic in that is that if you start saying that intimidation is a threat and be criminalized, especially around Israel, the role of Israeli influence. This bill could actually serve to reinforce Israeli influence in Canada, which in my opinion is more significant than Chinese interference, because it would
Absolutely. Absolutely.
bring in criminalizing those who were intimidating politicians or others who were enabling Israel's Holocaust in Gaza. So that would be
And I just want to say, Eve, something that's very personal to you. Our listeners may not know, but you, as I recall, were visited by RCMP officers at your home. Why, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was because you ran into the foreign minister at the time. Who's the former astronaut? What's his name again?
Mark Garneau.
Mark Garneau. I'm sorry, I forgot that, Mr. Garneau. But I think you ran into him in the street or something, and he got into a car, and you have no record of violence whatsoever. You popped into the car and started questioning him like a journalist about his, morally bankrupt support for various nefarious Canadian foreign policies. And the next day, the RCMP showed up at your house. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understood that they were more or less intimating that you had engaged in threatening or intimidating behavior. I can't think of a person, to be perfectly honest with you, Eve, who is more at risk under the new legislation than you, because you engage in vigorous, and by the standards of the mainstream media, shall we say, aggressive but perfectly nonviolent forms of journalism and activism. And this is you're exactly the kind of person, as am I. You and I have done some of these things together, right? You and I are really at risk under legislation of this nature because of this amorphous concept of intimidation.
Yeah. So okay, so now it's just on the legislative angle. So it's got I think it was on the 20th it passed. I guess they rammed it through the Senate just before the Senate closed for the summer, is my understanding. But so now it's just, it will be law as of what actually transpires, do you know, in terms of the coming weeks, or it is actually law as of today? They are modified, or is that still take some days to play out?
Well, it passed third reading, so it now I don't know whether they've actually gone through the formality, but basically the Trudeau government has to declare it into law.
Okay.
So I don't know whether he's actually done that, but if it isn't already, effectively the law of the land, it will be very shortly, and there's really nothing that can be done to stop that. Once the legislation actually is in effect, and it may already be in effect, it could be subjected to charter challenges. And as anybody out there who's listening to this and who feels that their rights under this legislation have been violated or maybe violated, I feel so strongly about this. I'm prepared in an appropriate case to represent a charter litigant on a pro bono basis. This law must be challenged.
So now shifting gears to the other kind of element to this, which is, okay, so it was all this foreign interference brouhaha in Canadian politics, panic. We had to like rush this legislation through because we're under some panic around foreign interference. That was the kind of argument being made in Parliament, I guess. Now, we've been hearing all this business about MPs being wittingly or unwittingly working with foreign government. They don't name names. There was this report that came out last month from, or I guess in May, from Marie-Augue, the justice that's overseeing her preliminary report on foreign interference, and she gave the media, the dominant media, what they wanted, which was that China is the big source of foreign interference in Canada, and then it's, which is interesting. I think it is important to remember that it was only back in 2018 and 2019 where the front page of the Walrus magazine was all about how Russia's influence intervening on Canadian democracy, right? So in 2018, 2019, the government set up this sort of commission to protect elections, which was not about China, but was about Russia and alleged Russian influence, which was because, of course, the claim was that Hillary Clinton, that Russia had got Donald Trump elected and defeated Hillary Clinton. And so that was supposed to be, Russia was going to then target our elections and stuff like that. So that foreign interference stuff has now over the past couple of years shifted towards China. But the main source in this, as I mentioned in the intro, that you see the Canadian military that wants conflict with China. They've head of the military last year saying China sees itself at war with Canada and its allies, sending naval vessels there, setting up a base there that goes back to 2017. And then you have the communication security establishment and pushing to ban Huawei and the whole business with arresting Meng Wanzhou in 2018, which was about weakening Huawei, which is China's first real sort of global high-tech company that was taking the world. And then now, really, I think recently, CSIS has really been the source of most of these kind of claims of foreign interference, of that there's politicians or whatever that are working for China. When you delve into it, they don't really provide much detail. Like what we have on the public record, one of the kind of the most, I would say, strongest piece they seem to have on the public record is this idea that Handong, there was like some international students, Chinese international students, that were bussed into a riding association electoral battle in the Toronto area to support Handong, which is, and the Chinese consulate may have been behind that. So that would be a form of intervention. If you think about it, it's not very big in terms of its claim of intervention, but this is one of the things but most of it's kind of left in pretty vague don't give us much detail. But so you published a piece kind of saying, like, should we trust CSIS? And can you just give us a little bit of a background on that and how that fits into what we understanding of the foreign interference kind of claims?
So this report, the foreign interference report, and by the way, this is all connected, right? They're releasing this report in heavily redacted form now because they're trying to push through this repressive anti-democratic legislation. It's not just Bill C-70, it's also the Online Harms Act, which fortunately has not yet been passed. They didn't ram that through Parliament before the summer break. So that's still a battle we can win. But they're putting this report and this hysteria out there to generate acquiescence in the rapid passage of this repressive legislation, the Online Arms Act and Bill C70, the Countering Foreign Interference Act. That's what's going on here. People need to understand that. So they put out this report in heavily redacted form in the early part of June, a month ago, after having given it to the Prime Minister in unredacted form in March. I've read the report. It's about 84, 85 pages long, and it is chock full of redactions, hundreds of redactions. And the source that the authors of the report, this is the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliament, NSI-COP. That's what the acronym is, okay? They cite CSIS repeatedly in the report, and far more than all other sources combined. The report, I can assure you, I read the report twice. I did it as somebody who has decades of experience in litigation. So I brought to bear my experience. I'm not infallible, but I brought to bear my extensive experience in the evaluation of evidence. And I didn't find one piece of hard evidence in that entire report, Eve. Absolutely nothing. It was really just CSIS says this and CSIS says that. It talks about this thing where these students were bussed in, for a nomination contest, allegedly at the insistence or the request of the Chinese government. And there may be evidence to back up that that happened, that the Chinese government caused a bunch of students to show up at this nomination contest, but I haven't seen it. It's not in the report. There's no hard evidence. There's no hard facts. And in fact, just so people understand, that the evidence isn't in the unredacted report either. Elizabeth May, as I mentioned in my article about this, the Green Party of Canada leader, went through all of the hoops to get access to this classified information, read the unredacted report, then did an interview with the Hill Times, a long interview in a Hill Times podcast a couple of weeks ago, which I listened to twice. And in it, she said, look, and she's a lawyer. By training, that's what she is. She's a lawyer. She said, this isn't really evidence. And there are really no hard facts. There's a lot of analysis. And she said, I myself find this very reliable. But she admitted that it's not evidence. It doesn't contain hard facts. And she even said that, earlier in her career as a leader of the Green Party of Canada, a Solicitor General of Canada told her that Maher Arar, a Syrian Canadian who was tortured in Syrian jails after he was rendered there by the United States with the collaboration, it appears, of CSIS, that he was a really bad actor. That's what the Solicitor General told Elizabeth May about Maher Arar, and it came from CSIS. And this man was tortured. This man received an apology from the Canadian government. There was a settlement in excess of $10 million. And Elizabeth May says, I learned from that experience. Take what CSIS has to say with a note of caution. I think that is a gross understatement. CSIS has repeatedly been caught lying by the Federal Court of Canada. CSIS has smeared two veteran police officers, Canadian police officers, based on nothing. This was reported by Al Jazeera last year. CSIS was aware that other Canadians were being sent to Syria to be tortured and didn't tell its superiors about this. I could go on, but when you look at the totality of the record of CSIS, it is a totally unreliable source, completely unreliable. Now, that doesn't mean everything that CSIS says is false. What it does mean is that if you're acting rationally, you shouldn't take CSIS at its word. You should say, look, show us the goods. If you make a claim against somebody, anybody, a foreign government, a Canadian, a member of parliament, a former member of parliament, as CSIS has done in very serious way, show us the evidence. And if you're not prepared to show us the evidence, we're not going to assume that what you're saying is true. That's what rational people would do. But this committee, the members of whom are not all members of parliament, they've appointed some senators, unelected senators to this committee. So it's not even a democratically representative. These people are drinking the Kool-Aid. They believe whatever CSIS says, apparently. There's not any indication whatsoever in their entire report that they applied any degree of healthy skepticism to what CSIS said, despite all of these instances, documented instances, some of which I've mentioned, of CSIS deception.
Yeah, well, I mean, we saw that when the former Governor General David Johnson headed up the initial interference inquiry, he was basically hounded out of the position by the media, saying that you're not telling us that we should all trust CSIS and that China's controlling our government, right? So it has been, and even Elizabeth May was sort of forced kind of a little bit to like walk back a bit of her initial reaction to the report when Jagmeet Singh joined in and saying this is so troubling and
Yeah, as I said, I've read the report, at least the unredacted version. I don't know what Jagmeet Singh, what drug that man is smoking, because there ain't nothing in there, nothing which establishes, even with a reasonable degree of likelihood, that a member of parliament has betrayed this country or is collaborating with some hostile foreign power. There's nothing to back that up.
but the whole ethos in the media is that this and the NDP, let's be clear about this. NDP has actually been very hawkish on China and has been criticizing for many years now the liberals from, I would say, from a pro Washington kind of perspective on this. Another piece in all of this that we should uh, I guess, bring to the table is that in the budget, what all of this sort of foreign interference kind of frenzy has led to concretely is a huge boost in CSIS's budget, right? CSIS got $655 million increase over 8 years to focus on foreign interference, right? That was added in the most recent liberal budget. So this has been the frenzy beyond pushing Canada towards a more belligerent position towards China. Concretely, this has been good for those institutions, notably CSIS, kind of pushing the frenzy. And also, I would say it's been good for the Canadian military, and that the more you hype up the China threat, that's part of the justification for these, significant boosting of military spending that we've been seeing. So it's important to see that the institutional benefit from these kind of policies.
Yeah,
Uh,
Eve, I just want to, if I may, because this is very important what you just said. I just want to drive this point home. A lot of people, in this country, and understandably so, they're very concerned about more immediate issues, and they're kind of vaguely aware about foreign interference and they're concerned about it, but they're not paying careful attention to the debate. You should pay careful attention to this debate. It will impact you enormously. In my article about this, I said at the very end, I didn't know, by the way, about the increase in funding for CSIS that just passed. I'm not even remotely surprised. And this is what I wrote without knowing about that. By manufacturing hysteria around alleged foreign interference by the West's official enemies, the committee, this Security Intelligence Committee, and its accomplices in the intelligence community and corporate media seek to generate public support for three objectives. One, the West's increasingly belligerent and dangerous posture towards Russia, China, and Iran. Most people don't want war. They're trying to build support for war. Number two, increase government spending on national security, which is what you just revealed, and the military. And three, censorship, particularly censorship in regard to Canadian foreign policy. And the more money, as we all know, that gets shifted to the military and to the national security agencies, the less money there is for our healthcare system, for our educational system, for affordable housing, and on, for poverty alleviation, for a clean environment. So this issue, this foreign interference hysteria, actually is of great importance to each and every Canadian. And I would recommend to our listeners, with the greatest of respect, that we pay very careful attention to this debate with a healthy dose of skepticism.
we'll leave it there. Thanks a lot for coming on to talking foreign policy.
Thank you, Eve. Always a pleasure.